On my graduation day, my mother called me a cheat. My revenge in court exposed her and won $300,000. At my graduation ceremony, my mother stood up and shouted, "She cheated her way through college." The entire auditorium stared. I walked to the podium, accepted my diploma, and whispered to the dean, who smiled and nodded. I was 3 steps away from shaking the dean's hand when my perfect graduation day shattered. My mother stood up in the audience and screamed the words I'd been dreading my entire life. She cheated her way through college. The entire auditorium turned to stare. The applause died instantly. Camera phones swiveled toward her voice like weapons. Dr. Henderson's outstretched hand froze in midair, my diploma trapped between his fingers. In my dreams, 500 pairs of eyes shifted between my mother and me, watching this family drama unfold on what should have been my moment of triumph. "She's a fraud," my mother continued, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "I know because I raised her." My legs threatened to buckle. The other graduates behind me shuffled nervously. Parents in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable glances. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and security guards began moving toward my mother's row, but I couldn't move. I stood there in my cap and gown, frozen between humiliation and rage. Then I saw my roommate Jessica's horrified face in the 3rd row. Her parents beside her looked mortified. Mrs. Peterson, my statistics professor, shook her head sadly from the faculty section. Everyone I cared about was witnessing this destruction. My mother wasn't finished. Ask her about the night she came crying to me for money. Ask her how she paid for her textbooks. She was standing now, pointing directly at me, her face twisted with years of resentment. She never earned anything in her life. The lies rolled off her tongue so easily. She'd always been gifted at rewriting history. In her version, I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family. She never mentioned cutting me off when I turned 18. She conveniently forgot the cruel words she'd spat at me when I chose my own major instead of the accounting degree she wanted. A professor I didn't recognize stood up and tried to calm the situation. "Ma'am, this is neither the time nor the place." "Don't tell me about time and place," my mother shot back. "I've been silent for 4 years while she pretended to be something she's not." Dr. Henderson cleared his throat into his microphone. The feedback screeched across the auditorium, making everyone wince. "Perhaps we should continue with the ceremony," he suggested diplomatically, but his eyes found mine with genuine concern. That's when something shifted inside me. The shame I'd carried for so long began transforming into something else entirely. My mother had chosen this public stage for a reason. She wanted maximum damage, maximum humiliation. She wanted to steal this moment from me just as she'd stolen so many others. But I wasn't 18 anymore. I wasn't the scared girl who had packed her belongings in garbage bags and slept on friends' couches. I had survived 4 years without her money, without her approval, without her toxic presence poisoning every achievement. I straightened my shoulders and took those 3 remaining steps toward Dr. Henderson. The crowd held its breath. My mother's voice rose again behind me, but I blocked out her words. I had learned to do that years ago. "Congratulations, Sarah," Dr. Henderson whispered as he handed me my diploma. His eyes held a question I couldn't answer yet. I leaned close to his ear, my voice steady despite the chaos behind me. "Dean Henderson, I need to speak with you privately after the ceremony. It's about my family situation, but it's also about something much bigger." He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his expression. "My office, 30 minutes." As I turned to walk across the stage, my mother's accusations continued echoing through the microphone someone had apparently given her. Security was definitely moving now, but she had found her audience and she was playing to it. "She thinks she's so smart, but I know the truth about her grades. I know about the favor she asked for." The other graduates parted as I walked toward the exit stairs. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, a few judgmental. My face burned with embarrassment, but I kept walking. Each step felt deliberate now, purposeful. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the security guards finally reaching my mother. Her voice grew more shrill as they escorted her out, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't give her that satisfaction. In the corridor outside the auditorium, families were gathering for photos. Children ran between the graduates in their caps and gowns. Normal families celebrating normal achievements in normal ways, everything I had wanted and would never have. My phone buzzed with texts. "Jessica, are you okay? That was insane. My study group from chemistry, ignore her, Sarah. We know who you really are. Even Professor Martinez, who rarely spoke to students outside class. "Don't let anyone dim your light today." But underneath their kindness, I could feel the questions forming. The doubt my mother had planted would grow roots. People would wonder if there was truth in her accusations. My reputation, built carefully over 4 years of genuine hard work, was now tainted. I found an empty classroom and sat down, still clutching my diploma. The plastic cover was warm from my sweating palms. Through the window, I could see families taking pictures on the quad, graduates throwing their caps in the air. The celebration continued, without me. My mother's words replayed in my mind, but now I heard them differently. Each lie revealed her desperation. Each false accusation showed her weakness. She had lost control over me years ago, and this was her final attempt to destroy what I had built. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had chosen to destroy me publicly in front of witnesses, in front of people who mattered. Dr. Henderson had seen her true nature. The professors had witnessed her cruelty. This wasn't just about me anymore. I stood up, smoothed my gown, and walked toward the dean's office. My graduation day was ruined, but something else was beginning, something my mother wasn't prepared for. Dr. Henderson's office felt like a sanctuary after the chaos outside. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. The walls were lined with diplomas and awards, a lifetime of academic achievements displayed with quiet pride. "Sarah, what happened out there was completely inappropriate," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "Your mother's behavior was unacceptable, and I want you to know that this institution stands behind you." I nodded, still gripping my diploma. "Dean Henderson, there's something you need to know. This didn't happen randomly. My mother has been planning to destroy me for months, maybe years." His eyebrows raised slightly. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would change everything. It started in February when my scholarship check bounced. The financial aid office said there was a problem with my account, but they couldn't explain what had happened. The memory of that day flooded back. I had been standing in line at the bursar's office, confidently waiting to collect my spring semester refund. The clerk had looked confused when she pulled up my account. "I'm sorry, Miss Anderson, but it appears your education fund has been completely depleted. There's actually a negative balance." I had stared at her computer screen in disbelief. The fund my grandfather had established for my education contained over $60,000 when I started college. I had been careful, budgeting every semester, never taking more than necessary. "That can't be right," I had told her. "Can you show me the transaction history?" What I saw made my stomach drop. Withdrawal after withdrawal dating back to my sophomore year. Large amounts transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. My carefully managed education fund had been systematically drained while I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover my living expenses. I knew something was seriously wrong. I continued to Dr. Henderson, so I used my savings from my campus bookstore job to hire a private investigator. His expression grew more serious. "That's quite a step for a college student to take." Frank Morrison specialized in financial fraud cases. He was expensive, but he was thorough. I remembered our first meeting in his cramped office above the pharmacy downtown. Frank was a retired police detective with kind eyes and calloused hands who treated my case with the same gravity he'd given major crimes. Within 2 weeks, Frank had uncovered a paper trail that made my blood boil. My mother hadn't just withdrawn money randomly. She had orchestrated a systematic theft, forging documents and impersonating me in phone calls to financial institutions. She had been intercepting my bank statements for over a year. I explained to Dr. Henderson. The bank had been mailing them to her address because she told them I was still living at home. She signed my name on withdrawal authorizations, claiming I needed the money for educational expenses. The most damaging discovery came when Frank traced the money to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. My mother had been funneling my education fund into her personal investment portfolio, using my college expenses as a cover story for her own financial schemes. But the worst part was the forged signatures, I continued. Frank hired a handwriting expert who confirmed that my mother had been practicing my signature. We found notebooks in her handwriting where she had written my name hundreds of times, perfecting the forgery. Dr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the magnitude of what I was telling him. "Sarah, this is criminal behavior. Have you contacted the authorities?" "Not yet. I wanted to document everything first. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the evidence I had been collecting. I have recordings of phone calls where she mocked me for struggling financially. She would call me lazy and irresponsible while she was literally stealing my money. One particular conversation haunted me. My mother had called me in March right after I had picked up extra shifts at the campus library to pay for textbooks. "Still working yourself to death, I see," she had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Maybe if you had chosen a practical major instead of that useless psychology degree, you wouldn't be so broke." I had bitten my tongue, not knowing that she was spending my education money on luxury handbags and spa treatments. Frank had shown me credit card statements proving she had charged over $3,000 to high-end retailers in the same month she told me I was financially irresponsible. "I started recording every conversation after that," I told Dr. Henderson. She couldn't help herself. She kept calling to remind me how much I needed her, how I would never succeed without her support. The irony was unbearable. The worst call had happened just 2 weeks before graduation. My mother had sounded particularly pleased with herself. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about your future. Without family support, you're going to struggle in the real world. Maybe it's time you admitted that you need your mother's guidance." I had stayed silent, letting her talk while my phone recorded every word. "I've always known you'd come crawling back eventually. You're not as independent as you pretend to be. Deep down, you're still that scared little girl who needs mommy to fix everything." Her laughter had echoed through the phone, cold and calculating. She had no idea that Frank was sitting across from me, documenting her psychological manipulation as evidence of financial abuse. "I spent weeks preparing for today," I admitted to Dr. Henderson. "I knew she would try something dramatic. She's always been theatrical when she wants to hurt me, but I never expected her to destroy my graduation ceremony." Dr. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of my mother's deception. "Sarah, what you're describing is not just theft. This is a pattern of financial and emotional abuse that spans years." I nodded, feeling the weight of finally sharing this burden with someone who understood. "The private investigator has everything documented. Bank records, forged signatures, recorded conversations, even receipts showing how she spent my education money on personal luxuries. What do you plan to do with this information?" I looked directly at him, my voice steady and determined. "I'm going to make sure she faces consequences for what she's done. Not just to me, but to anyone else she might hurt in the future." The afternoon sun streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across his desk. Outside, I could hear families still celebrating, graduates laughing with their loved ones, normal people living normal lives, unaware of the battle that had been quietly raging in mine. "Dean Henderson, I need your help with something important. I need you to be a witness," I said, watching Dr. Henderson's expression carefully. "When I file the lawsuit against my mother, I'm going to need people who witnessed her behavior today. People with credibility." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Sarah, are you certain this is the path you want to take? Legal action against family is never simple." "She made it public first," I replied. "She chose to humiliate me in front of 500 people. Now she gets to face the consequences publicly, too." The next morning, I sat in attorney Margaret Chen's office downtown, watching her review Frank Morrison's investigative report. Margaret came highly recommended by the university's legal aid office, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes who specialized in financial crimes. "This is one of the most thorough fraud cases I've seen from a private investigator," Margaret said, flipping through the documents. "Your mother didn't just steal money, Sarah. She committed identity theft, wire fraud, and forgery. These are federal crimes." My hands trembled slightly as I signed the paperwork to initiate the civil lawsuit. Margaret had explained that criminal charges would come later, but the civil case would force my mother to return the stolen funds immediately. "The process server will deliver the papers this afternoon," Margaret explained. "Are you prepared for her reaction?" I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety. I've been preparing for this moment for months. At exactly 3:47 p.m., my phone rang. My mother's number appeared on the screen, and I answered on the second ring, putting it on speaker so Margaret could hear. "What have you done?" My mother's voice was shrill, panic barely contained beneath her fury. Some stranger just handed me legal papers at my front door. "I filed a lawsuit for theft and fraud," I said calmly. "Everything is documented, Mom. The forged signatures, the offshore accounts, every penny you stole." "Stole? I never stole anything. That money was for your education and you wasted it on your stupid degree." Margaret raised her eyebrows, gesturing for me to keep her talking. My mother's admissions were building our case with every word. You moved $63,000 to a Cayman Islands account in your name, I continued. While I worked 2 jobs and survived on ramen noodles, you were buying designer purses and taking spa vacations. You can't prove any of that, and after everything I sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me. Actually, I can prove it. I have bank records, forged documents, and recorded phone calls. Everything you've done is documented. The line went quiet for several seconds. When my mother spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming artificially sweet and manipulative. Honey, you're being ridiculous. We're family. We can work this out without lawyers and courts. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight and we'll talk about this like adults? Margaret shook her head firmly, mouthing, Absolutely not. The time for talking ended when you destroyed my graduation ceremony, I replied. You'll hear from my attorney. I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. Margaret looked impressed. That went better than expected. She essentially admitted to moving the money and tried to manipulate you into dropping the case. Textbook financial abuse behavior? Within hours, news of the lawsuit began spreading through our small town. Millbrook had only 12,000 residents, and legal drama involving prominent families traveled fast. My mother served on the hospital board and volunteered with several charities. Her public image was carefully cultivated over decades. By evening, my phone was buzzing with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered support, others demanded explanations. Mrs. Patterson from across the street texted, Honey, I always knew something wasn't right about your mother's finances. She bragged about expensive vacations while claiming she couldn't afford to help with your college. The most surprising message came from Jennifer Walsh, my mother's former friend from the country club. Sarah, I need to tell you something about your mother's gambling problem. Can we meet for coffee? The next morning, Jennifer and I sat in a corner booth at Millbrook Diner, away from curious ears. Jennifer looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if my mother might appear. She's been lying to everyone for years, Jennifer began. About 5 years ago, she started organizing bus trips to the casino. At first, it seemed harmless, just ladies having fun, but then she started borrowing money. Borrowing money from whom? From everyone. She asked me for $3,000, claiming it was for a medical emergency. She borrowed from other women in our bridge club, too. None of us ever got paid back. My stomach sank as Jennifer continued revealing the scope of my mother's financial deception. She had been running what amounted to a pyramid scheme among her social circle, borrowing money from one friend to pay back another while feeding her gambling addiction. Last month, she showed up at my house desperate for cash, Jennifer whispered. She claimed you were in some kind of trouble and needed emergency money for legal fees. She wanted me to write a check for $5,000. What did you tell her? I said no, but Sarah, she seemed different, desperate, almost manic. That's when I started wondering where all her money was really coming from. That afternoon, Margaret called with an update. The court has scheduled a preliminary hearing for next week. Your mother hired an attorney, Richard Blackwood, from the city. He's expensive, which is interesting considering she's claiming financial hardship. She's probably using my stolen money to pay for her defense lawyer, I said bitterly. That's actually good for our case. We can trace those payments, too. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse wearing my best suit. The building was smaller than I'd expected, with marble floors that echoed our footsteps. Margaret carried a briefcase filled with evidence while I clutched a folder containing copies of everything. My mother sat across the aisle with her attorney, wearing a navy dress and pearls, looking like the perfect picture of respectability. She wouldn't make eye contact with me, instead whispering urgently to Mr. Blackwood. Judge Patricia Reeves entered the courtroom and everyone stood. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back severely and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. This is a preliminary hearing for the case of Anderson versus Anderson, she announced. Miss Chen, please present your client's claims. Margaret stood confidently, her voice clear and professional. Your Honor, we're seeking damages for systematic financial fraud committed by the defendant against her own daughter over a period of 3 years. The defendant forged signatures, intercepted mail, and transferred approximately $63,000 from the plaintiff's education fund to personal accounts. My mother's lawyer stood to respond. Your Honor, this is simply a family financial dispute being blown out of proportion by a vindictive daughter. Mrs. Anderson acted as a concerned parent, managing her child's finances. Judge Reeves looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Anderson, did you have legal authority to access your daughter's education fund after she turned 18? My mother's voice cracked as she replied, I was protecting her interests, Your Honor. She was irresponsible with money. That's not what I asked. Did you have legal authority to move funds from an account in her name to accounts in your name? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. My mother's face flushed red as she realized her mistake. Mrs. Anderson, I'm ordering a complete forensic audit of all financial transactions involved in this case. We will reconvene in 30 days with a full accounting. As we left the courthouse, I noticed my phone had 17 missed calls from family members. The news of the forensic audit had apparently traveled fast through our extended family network. The first voicemail was from my Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister. Sarah, honey, we need to talk. There are things about your mother you don't know, things that happened years ago. Please, call me back. I dialed her number from Margaret's office while we waited for copies of the court documents. Aunt Linda answered on the first ring, her voice strained and urgent. Sarah, I've been carrying this secret for 15 years, but after what happened in court today, I can't stay silent anymore. What secret, Aunt Linda? Your mother stole from me, too. When your grandmother died, she left money for you and Tommy's college funds, $50,000 each, held in trust until you turned 18. Your mother was supposed to manage it, but she moved the money into her own investments. My hands went numb. She stole my inheritance. She convinced me it was a better investment strategy, said she was protecting the money from taxes. I trusted her because she was my older sister and she seemed so knowledgeable about finances. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Not only had my mother stolen my education fund, but she had been stealing from family for decades. Every story about being a devoted mother, every guilt trip about sacrificing for her children had been built on lies. Aunt Linda, why didn't you ever tell me? She threatened to cut me off from the family if I said anything. And honestly, Sarah, I was ashamed. I should have protected that money for you and Tommy, but I let her manipulate me. That evening, I drove to Tommy's apartment across town. My 22-year-old brother worked at a mechanic shop and lived in a small place above the garage. He'd always been my mother's favorite, the one who could do no wrong in her eyes. Tommy opened the door wearing greasy coveralls, his hands still stained from working on an engine. Sarah, what are you doing here? Mom said you were trying to destroy the family. Can I come in? We need to talk. His apartment was sparse but clean, with a folding table that served as both desk and dining room. I spread out copies of the financial documents Margaret had given me, watching Tommy's expression change as he processed what he was seeing. This can't be right, he said, studying a bank statement showing transfers from our education funds. Mom told me your college money ran out because you were spending it on parties and clothes. Tommy, look at the dates. She was moving this money while I was working 2 jobs and living on mac and cheese. His face crumpled as the reality sank in. She used to call me complaining about how irresponsible you were with money. She said you kept asking her for help and she had to keep bailing you out. I never asked her for a penny after she cut me off. Every conversation we had, she was stealing from me while lecturing me about responsibility. Tommy sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. What about my college fund? Did she steal from me too? I pulled out another set of documents. She moved your money into the same offshore account. But Tommy, your fund was smaller to begin with because she'd been using it to cover expenses since you were 16. No. His voice was barely a whisper. She always said she was saving every penny for my education. That's why I couldn't go to the university I wanted. She said we couldn't afford it. The next few days brought an avalanche of revelations as family members began sharing their own experiences with my mother's financial manipulation. My cousin Rachel called to tell me about a loan that was never repaid. My uncle David mentioned strange requests for emergency money over the years. But the most shocking call came from my grandmother's former neighbor, Mrs. Elizabeth Morris, who had somehow gotten my number. Dear, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I saw the news about your lawsuit in the paper. I knew your grandmother well, and there's something I need to tell you about the week she passed away. Mrs. Morris was 86 and spoke slowly, but her memory was sharp. Your mother came to your grandmother's house the day after the funeral. She had boxes and was removing documents from your grandmother's desk. When I asked her about it, she said she was handling the estate paperwork. What kind of documents? Bank statements, insurance papers, investment records. But Sarah, your grandmother had shown me her will just months before she died. She was very specific about leaving money for your education. She was so proud that you wanted to go to college. My throat tightened with emotion I hadn't expected. My grandmother had died when I was 15, and my mother had told me she'd left everything to charity, except for a few personal items. Mrs. Morris, do you remember anything specific about the will? She left $50,000 each for you and your brother's education, and another $20,000 for your future wedding. She wanted to make sure you had choices in life, dear. She was very concerned about your mother's controlling behavior. That revelation sent me straight back to Margaret's office. If my mother had hidden additional inheritance money, it meant the theft was even more extensive than we documented. Margaret immediately filed for expanded discovery, demanding access to all of my mother's financial records from the past 20 years. Sarah, if she's been systematically stealing inheritance money, we're looking at a much larger case. The legal pressure began affecting my mother's social standing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her bridge club meetings stopped. The hospital board quietly asked her to step down from her volunteer position. Even the grocery store clerks treated her differently, their polite smiles replaced with cool professionalism. Tommy started avoiding her calls and eventually moved in with his girlfriend to escape the constant pressure to choose sides. She keeps asking me to convince you to drop the lawsuit, he told me one evening. She says, you're destroying the family for money you don't even need. What do you tell her? The truth that she destroyed the family when she decided to steal from her own children. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing. I was in my apartment grading papers for the substitute teaching job I'd taken when I heard shouting outside. Through my window, I saw my mother standing on the sidewalk, her hair disheveled and her voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood. Sarah, I know you're in there. You need to stop this nonsense right now. I didn't move from my position by the window, watching as she paced back and forth like a caged animal. Neighbors were starting to come outside, drawn by the commotion. You're destroying everything I've worked for, everything I've built. And for what? Money you don't even need. She started up the steps to my front door, pounding with both fists. Open this door. We're family. You can't do this to your own mother. The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. This wasn't the controlled, manipulative woman who had terrorized my childhood. This was someone who had finally lost control of her carefully constructed image. I sacrificed everything for you and your brother. Everything. And this is how you repay me. Mrs. Peterson from next door appeared on her porch, her phone in her hand. Sarah, honey, should I call the police? My mother heard her and spun around. Mind your own business. This is between me and my daughter. But then something changed. Her voice broke and she collapsed onto my porch steps, sobbing with an intensity that shook her entire body. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother as she truly was not the powerful matriarch, but a desperate woman whose lies had finally caught up with her. I stayed by the window until she eventually got up and walked back to her car, leaving behind only the echo of her breakdown and the certain knowledge that our relationship, whatever it had been, was truly over. The final hearing was scheduled for a crisp October morning, 6 months after my mother's breakdown on my porch. The courthouse steps were slick with fallen leaves, and I could see my breath in the cool air as Margaret and I climbed toward the entrance. Remember, Sarah, Margaret said as we walked through the metal detectors. Today is about justice, not revenge. Let the evidence speak. The courtroom was packed. Tommy sat in the front row behind me, his girlfriend Lisa holding his hand tightly. Aunt Linda had driven down from Chicago, her face drawn with exhaustion from years of carrying secrets. Even Mrs. Morris, the elderly neighbor, had insisted on attending despite her age. My mother sat across the aisle with Mr. Blackwood, looking smaller than I remembered. Her designer clothes had been replaced with a simple black dress, and her usually perfect hair hung limp around her shoulders. The months of legal pressure had aged her visibly. Judge Reeves entered exactly at 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her seat. We are here today for the final ruling in Anderson versus Anderson. Both parties have submitted their evidence and the court has reviewed all forensic reports. She gestured to the witness stand where Dr. Patricia Hammond, the handwriting expert, sat with a folder full of documents. Dr. Hammond was a woman in her 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the quiet confidence of someone who had testified in hundreds of cases. Dr. Hammond, please present your findings to the court. Dr. Hammond opened her folder and pulled out a series of enlarged signature comparisons. Your Honor, I analyzed over 40 documents spanning 3 years. The evidence clearly shows systematic signature forgery. She held up one of the documents, pointing to my supposed signature on a bank withdrawal form. This signature was created by someone attempting to mimic the plaintiff's handwriting. You can see the hesitation marks here, where the forger paused to ensure accuracy. A genuine signature flows naturally without these interruptions. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mr. Blackwood whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Furthermore, Dr. Hammond continued, I found practice sheets in the defendant's handwriting where she had written the plaintiff's name repeatedly, perfecting the forgery. This demonstrates premeditation and intent to deceive. Judge Reeves studied the evidence carefully. Dr. Hammond, in your professional opinion, is there any possibility these signatures were legitimate? None whatsoever, Your Honor. The defendant systematically forged her daughter's signature to gain unauthorized access to financial accounts. This was not a case of similar handwriting or family resemblance. This was deliberate fraud. The silence in the courtroom was complete. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the judge's bench. My mother's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Judge Reeves turned to address the courtroom directly. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. Mrs. Anderson systematically stole from her daughter's education fund through forgery, identity theft, and wire fraud. She violated not only the law, but the fundamental trust between parent and child. She paused, her eyes moving between my mother and me. This court finds that the defendant unlawfully transferred $63,400 from the plaintiff's education fund. Additionally, the evidence shows she concealed inheritance funds totaling $70,000 that were specifically designated for the plaintiff's education and future. My mother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Tommy reached over and squeezed my shoulder. Mrs. Anderson, Judge Reeves continued, her voice stern, your actions represent a betrayal of the most basic parental responsibilities. You stole from your own child while she worked multiple jobs to pay for basic necessities. She lifted her gavel. Therefore, this court orders you to repay the full amount of $133,400 plus punitive damages of an equal amount plus interest and legal fees. The total judgment is $300,000. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. My mother's composure finally shattered completely. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably while Mr. Blackwood tried unsuccessfully to calm her. The sound of her crying filled the courtroom, raw and desperate. I felt Tommy's hand tighten on my shoulder, but I couldn't take my eyes off my mother. I had imagined this moment for months, but I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Instead, I felt hollow, like something inside me had finally been put to rest. Judge Reeves wasn't finished. Mrs. Anderson, I am also referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The systematic nature of your fraud warrants criminal charges. As court officers began the process of serving the judgment papers, reporters who had somehow learned about the case crowded near the doors. Margaret quickly guided me toward a side exit, but I could hear their voices calling out questions. Sarah, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you be pursuing criminal charges? What's your relationship with your mother now? I kept walking, saying nothing. This wasn't about publicity or revenge. It was about justice for the scared 18-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her home and told she was worthless. That evening, I sat in my small apartment with a certified check for the first payment from my mother's assets. Mr. Blackwood had explained that she would need to liquidate her house, her car, and her investment accounts to meet the judgment. She would be left with almost nothing. The check felt surreal in my hands. More money than I had ever imagined, obtained through the destruction of the woman who had given birth to me. Tommy sat across from me, equally stunned by the day's events. She's going to have to sell the house, he said quietly. The house we grew up in. I know, Sarah. Do you think we did the right thing? I looked at him, this younger brother who had stood by me even when it meant losing the only parent he had left. Tommy, she stole our futures. She stole our grandmother's love for us. She would have kept stealing until there was nothing left. He nodded, but I could see the pain in his eyes. Winning in court didn't erase the fact that we were now orphans by choice, cut off from the only family we had known. Margaret called later that evening to discuss the criminal referral. Sarah, the district attorney is very interested in this case. Your mother's pattern of financial abuse could result in significant prison time. How long? With the forgery charges, wire fraud, and the systematic nature of the theft, she could face 5 to 10 years. I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. My mother, who had once seemed so powerful and controlling, was about to lose everything. Her money, her house, her freedom, her reputation, all destroyed by her own greed and cruelty. Margaret, what happens now? Now we wait for the criminal proceedings to begin. And Sarah, you should be proud of yourself. You stood up to someone who had power over you your entire life, and you won. But as I hung up the phone and looked around my small apartment, I realized that the idea came to me 3 weeks after the verdict. While I was sorting through my grandmother's jewelry box that Aunt Linda had finally given me, hidden beneath the velvet lining, I found a yellowed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's careful script. Inside was a letter dated just months before her death. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means your mother never gave you the inheritance I left for your education. I pray that someday you'll find a way to use your gifts to help other young women who need a chance. You have more strength than you know. All my love, Grandma Rose. My hands trembled as I folded the letter. Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother was guiding me towards something bigger than my own pain. That same afternoon, I called Margaret to discuss establishing a foundation. I want to create a scholarship fund for women who've been cut off from family support, I told her. Young women who are trying to build futures without anyone believing in them. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months of legal battles. Sarah, that's beautiful. What do you want to call it? The Rose Anderson Memorial Scholarship, after my grandmother. Within 6 months, the foundation was official. I had invested most of the settlement money into an endowment that would provide scholarships indefinitely. The first recipient would receive $15,000 toward her education, with smaller amounts going to 4 additional students each year. My mother's attempts to contact me intensified as news of the scholarship spread through local newspapers. She left voicemails that progressed from angry demands to tearful pleas, but I never listened to them completely. Tommy would update me occasionally. She had moved into a small apartment across town, worked at a department store, and seemed genuinely shocked that her actions had consequences. She keeps asking me to give you her letters, Tommy told me during one of our weekly dinners. She says she's changed, that she understands what she did wrong. What do you tell her? The truth, that some things can't be fixed with apologies. I had burned the first few letters without opening them, but eventually curiosity won and I read one. It was filled with the same manipulation. I remembered taking partial responsibility while blaming circumstances, promising change while making excuses. I threw it away and never opened another. My new life took shape slowly. I bought a small house on Elm Street with a front porch and a backyard perfect for a garden. The previous owner had left behind rose bushes that reminded me of my grandmother's garden, and I spent weekends learning to care for them. The biggest change came when I visited the animal shelter on a rainy Saturday morning. I wasn't planning to adopt anything, just volunteering to walk dogs, but a 3-year-old golden retriever mix named Honey chose me, following me around the yard and sitting patiently by my feet during the entire volunteer orientation. She's been here for 4 months, the shelter coordinator explained. She was surrendered when her elderly owner moved to assisted living. She's gentle and well-trained, but people want puppies. Honey rode home in my passenger seat that day, her head out the window and her tail wagging. For the first time in years, my house felt truly alive. I also returned to painting, something I had abandoned in college when my mother mocked it as impractical. My small spare bedroom became a studio filled with canvases and the smell of oil paints. I painted landscapes, mostly peaceful scenes that had nothing to do with courtrooms or family drama. The first scholarship ceremony was held at the community college where I had taken evening classes after high school. 5 young women sat in the front row, each with her own story of family rejection or financial abandonment. Maria, the primary recipient, was 23 and studying nursing after her parents disowned her for leaving an abusive marriage. As I stood behind the podium, looking at these brave young women who had chosen education over surrender, I felt my grandmother's presence strongly. Education isn't just about degrees or career opportunities, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. It's about proving to yourself that you're worthy of investment, that your dreams matter, that you can build something beautiful from broken pieces. Maria wiped tears from her eyes. Two of the other recipients held hands, supporting each other as they had probably learned to do when family support wasn't available. Each of you has already demonstrated the most important quality for success: resilience. You've chosen to move forward when others tried to hold you back. You've chosen hope when despair would have been easier. I paused, looking at their young faces, full of determination and possibility. This scholarship comes with one requirement. When you're established in your careers, when you're stable and successful, find another young woman who needs a chance and help her. That's how we build something lasting from temporary pain. The ceremony ended with individual meetings where I got to hear their stories. Sarah Beth was studying computer programming after being kicked out for refusing an arranged marriage. Jennifer was pursuing her teaching degree despite her family's insistence that college was wasted on women. Lisa wanted to become a social worker to help other abuse survivors. As the evening wound down and the recipients left with their checks and congratulations, I stood alone in the empty conference room. The weight I had carried for so many years, the anger, the resentment, the constant need to prove my worth to someone who would never see it, had finally lifted. Tommy found me there, straightening chairs and collecting empty coffee cups. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," I said, and meant it completely. For the first time in my life, I feel free. Walking to my car that night, I realized something profound had shifted. I wasn't Sarah Anderson, the daughter who had been publicly humiliated and financially abused. I wasn't the victim who had fought back in court and won. I was simply Sarah, a woman who had survived her past and chosen to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Honey was waiting for me on the front porch when I got home, her tail wagging in the porch light. My roses were blooming despite the late season, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. Inside, canvases waited for new paintings, new visions of beauty that had nothing to do with old pain. I had everything I needed. I had built a life that belonged entirely to me, funded a future for young women who needed chances, and finally understood what my grandmother had seen in me all those years ago: the strength to transform suffering into something beautiful, something useful, something that would outlast the people who had tried to diminish me. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.